evolved for interactive real-time communication. It didn't evolve for one-sided oratory. Even what I'm going to tell you is going to be kind of a conversation with myself. When I was an undergraduate at McGill, when I turned 17, I became a vegetarian, and I started to practice meditation, and I did throughout my undergraduate years. And now I'm having a conversation with myself then, because I have to say that I'm profoundly ashamed of having been just a vegetarian now, late in my life. And I also feel, not profoundly, but mildly ashamed that I was so preoccupied with my so-called spiritual states that I neglected what was going on outside me in the real world. And that's really what this talk is going to be about. It's not really an antagonistic opposition between, you could easily characterize it as morality versus spirituality. But it's not that simple. The fact is that there is a substance that the body secretes called oxytocin. It's secreted especially by women when they're lactating and having children. And some people believe, and it might be true, that oxytocin is related to empathy and compassion for other creatures. It's really meant for our empathy towards our own progeny, because we shouldn't be programmed so that we eat them or neglect them or harm them. So we have this special feeling of caring and attachment for our own progeny, also sometimes for our spouses. It's not necessarily that effective. Oxytocin works more for kids. But it generalizes. It turns out that I had this stupid idea that that adopt this, I can't tell you how many stupid ideas I've had. You're right to say that, all right, so maybe these are stupid ideas that I'm telling you now as well, but it's a conversation, isn't it? I had this stupid idea that somehow adopted children were not the same as natural children, that somehow you couldn't love them the same way, you wouldn't have the same feeling towards them. Whenever somebody said, this is my sister and this is my adopted sister, I said, so that's your real sister and that's your... What utter nonsense. And the way that you discover that that's utter nonsense is by falling in love with a pet who's never a genetic relative or a close genetic relative of yours. Then you realize that you can become just as attached, just as caring about another creature that isn't blood related to you. It's just that it's true and it's undeniable. I'm a Darwinian. I mean, we're organisms on the earth which has life, and we evolve with certain tendencies, and one of the tendencies is to favor our own. And I'll come back to that a little bit later, because I think you would have to be a psychopath, really, to accept the philosophers. This is not the usual philosopher's railroad with the tracks dividing into two, and you can kill 6 people or 26 people or whatever. And this is the one that's a variant of it that's kind of morbid, where what happens is, whoops, I thought I would be able to do a PowerPoint, but I need this for my guidance. This one is that the train is about to hit your own child, and you can reroute it to hit someone else's child. And I would say, it's controversial, this is a conversation, that you have to be a psychopath to say, well, I better toss a coin because it's not fair otherwise. I think every normal person would reroute the train from their own child. It's a selfish thing. We have selfish genes, but it's undeniable we're that way. But the thing is, there are very few situations in life that are that extreme, and that particular one you're never going to face, only in a philosophy course. So let's set it aside. Apart from necessities, like my own, if somebody's pushing your head under the water and you can't breathe, there's nothing that's more important to you than to crawl your way back into air. Anything. If you had to step on your mother's head, you couldn't stop yourself, because your brainstem is so strong that it just has to have that air. But we're not in that situation. It's ridiculous, and it's even sophistic to bring up situations like that to cover cases where there's no such conflict of interest and necessity involved. Anyway, I've jumped too quickly to the middle of my talk. The title that I picked is a racy one. The other minds problem, that's pretty calm. Or orgasms, mine, versus agony, theirs. That's the other minds problem. It's not really about sex or sexual morality that I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to make a few funny sort of semi-jocular connections with sex in a moment. It starts with Descartes. If I had been allowed to use my PowerPoint, you would now be seeing a picture of Descartes on the screen. And Descartes didn't invent the mind-body problem or the problem of consciousness, but he was one of the people who articulated it in a certain way. And I think the way that he articulated was mostly right and informative. So let's start with that. Descartes asked himself, students of my courses can tune out for a couple of minutes because you've heard this. Descartes asked himself, what can I be sure about? He didn't ask himself what's true. He's interested in what's true, but he said not just true, but things that are true and that you can be sure that they're true. And he quickly enumerated what the classical skeptics said, the things that you couldn't be sure about. You can't be sure, for example, of the fact that the laws of science hold, that when you let go of an apple, it'll always fall down rather than up. It will, it's true, it is going to fall down, but you can't be sure. Tomorrow, things could be different. The law of gravitation could reverse, or it could have been wrong, or it could have been an approximation or anything. So the laws of science are not certain. They may be true, they probably are true. They are true, but they're not certain. More than that, I mean, more philosophical things, even the fact that there's an outside world there with apples and people is not certain. It's true, but it's not certain. You can't be sure. You can't be sure that other people, if there are other people, have minds. Maybe they don't. You can't be sure that tomorrow is going to be like yesterday, etc. So these are all the things that are uncertain. He asked himself, are there any things that I can be sure about? And one of them, a standard one, was the truths of mathematics that are necessarily true on pain of contradiction. If the word true, yes?
I remember in mathematics it was proved that you cannot be sure about mathematics. That was Bertrand Russell's great, what's Bertrand Russell's last great achievement?
Yes. Well, I'm quite willing to discuss Gödel and Russell, but it's not quite opportune here. Okay. Where, they didn't say that mathematics wasn't true. They said that it wasn't complete.
It wasn't sure.
They didn't say it wasn't sure. They said it wasn't complete. They didn't say, for example, that the truths of propositional calculus are not necessary and sure. Propositional calculus is not strong enough to include arithmetic, and therefore you can't run Gödel's proof in propositional calculus. You can run it in arithmetic. So, I repeat, if you want, I can replace mathematics by mathematics that is less than arithmetic.
Yes.
But
is reason sure?
Pardon me?
Is reason sure?
What do you mean by sure?
By sure, exactly the same definition, the meaning of sure, with everything else. What can we be sure of? The common meaning is understood by many people of the word sure. It's language. Evolved in conversations.
Now I think you're beginning to launch into a rival theory, which I would rather have you leave for discussion. You can question what I'm saying, but don't propose a rival theory right here. Okay, for me, it's all right to ask me what sure is. There's two ways that you can think of what sure is. One is that whatever feels sure, like it's surely true, is surely true. I'll get to that in a second. The other one is that there's some objective way, and one of the objective ways is to say that anything that leads to a logical contradiction, anything that leads to the fact that P is true and P is also not true, can't be sure if sure means anything at all. Yes?
Quantum theory has disproved what you just said.
Pardon me?
Quantum theory has disproved that many times.
Quantum theory proves nothing. It's like apples falling. Quantum theory is a theory of what there is in the universe. Proofs are mathematical.
Proofs are practical, they work.
What you have in the universe is things and irregularities which the laws of science try to explain. They don't prove, they try to explain. The law of universal gravitation tries to explain why apples fall down, and quantum mechanics tries to explain why it is that when you're using radioactive material and emitting particles, it behaves like a wave. And if you're, when you're measuring it with a two-slit experiment, and it behaves like a particle when you're measuring it with a Geiger counter, that looks like a contradiction. And quantum mechanics says both of those things are still true. But in fact, they never occur at the same time, so they're not really a contradiction, they're just
They
a
are.
principal contradiction. But let me suggest,
Okay.
we're getting into abstractions that nobody but you and me are going to follow over here. So let's leave it for this.
Conversation, I'm challenging you.
Okay, yes, fine. So the answer to the challenge is science proves nothing.
And I
Mathematics
challenge that.
proves. And mathematics proves on pain of contradiction. And it's very mild stuff because I'm going to leave it alone. That's just the formal world of mathematics. It's stuff that you suppose, and then if you supposed it to be true formally, then there's certain other things that you're not free to suppose because they're in contradiction. That doesn't help anything in the real world. The other thing, the opposite end of the continuum of things that you can be sure about, besides the necessary truths of mathematics, is the cogito. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's the fact that I'm thinking when I'm thinking. You cannot doubt that you're thinking when you're thinking. You can doubt everything else. You can doubt that apples fall, but you can't doubt that you're doubting. That was the way that Descartes put it, but I want to give it to you in a much less paradoxical way. Somebody pinches you. It hurts. Are you sure it hurts? Can you doubt that? You can doubt lots of things. You can doubt that he's pinching you. Maybe he doesn't exist. Maybe it's just a hallucination. You can doubt that there's that you can think that he's not really pinching you, but it's referred pain from your other hand. Those are all things that you can be skeptical about. But the fact that it feels like what it feels like, you can't doubt, and that is a rock solid certainty. As rock solid, in fact, if anything, I don't know if you can't be more rock solid. It's as rock solid as the law of non-contradiction. But it's based on subjective experience, whereas non-contradiction is completely formal. It just says you can't suppose P and not P at the same time. That's what we got from Descartes. And the legacy of that was the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem was this thing that you can be sure of, which we call consciousness, and it has dozens and dozens of other synonyms and pseudonyms. This thing, consciousness, what is it in the world? I mean, we're going to forget about certainty now because Descartes was talking about what you could be certain about, not what could be true about. Let's assume, because it's true, that most of what science tells us is true. There really is an outside world. There really are organisms. There really are trees, plants, rocks, mountains, planets, etc. We know what the way those work. Physics tells us, biology tells us, and probably the laws of physics and biology are true. You can't be sure, you can't prove it, but they're probably true. How do they explain consciousness? How do they explain the fact that organisms, which exist on the earth and are alive, feel? And that's the other message I'm bringing to you. It's of all of those synonyms about consciousness, most of them are just diversions. They send you into other issues that are not really the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is the following, and you can trust me on this, although nothing is certain. The mind-body problem is that there is a profound difficulty that everybody on the planet, even the ones who deny it, have in explaining how and why physical states, which are no problem at all, an apple falling is a physical state, a toaster is in a physical state, a computer, etc., planets revolving around the sun, those are all physical states, atoms, quantum states. How is it that some physical states in organisms are felt? They're felt states. How and why are some physical states felt states? That is the mind-body problem. It's not an ontological problem. It's not, ontological means what is there in the world. The ontological problem is over when I tell you, we feel. I have Cartesian certainty that I feel, and I trust that all of you also feel as well. So feeling exists. The problem is not an ontological problem. It's an epistemic problem. How do you explain, in the same way that you explain apples falling, how do you explain the fact that organisms feel? You'd have no problem if organisms just acted, did things. Darwinian explanation is there to explain why it is that birds can fly and fish can swim and we favor our own progeny and etc. and mammals give milk and sexual reproduction. All of that stuff is explained in the usual way by science, in its usual true but not certain way. But what science can't explain, hasn't even got a clue of a clue about, is how and why organisms feel. In the discussion, you're going to have lots of hypotheses. You say, for God's sake, if I didn't feel, then if I burnt myself, I wouldn't notice it, and that would be bad evolutionarily. So obviously, the reason I feel is so that I can feel. No. For evolution, it would be sufficient if, whenever you stick your limb into something that's burning, and it injures your skin, there should be a mechanism that detects the injury and does the right thing. In the end, it's a mechanism that detects the injury and does the right thing anyway. That's what cognitive science is trying to explain. It's trying to explain what's not the problem of consciousness, but the so-called easy problem of how and why organisms can do all of the things that they can do. And one of the things we can do is avoid pain, talk, recognize things, etc. That's what cognitive science is trying to explain. But that doesn't explain how or why any of that is felt. Detecting tissue injury is not the same as feeling pain, and yet we feel pain. So those are the legacy of Descartes, and I want to separate the legacy into two parts. The problem of consciousness itself, which I've just said, how and why do organisms feel, which is normally thought of as an ontological problem. What is there in the world? Is there one kind of thing, physical thing, or is there two kinds of things, physical things and mental things? In other words, actions and feelings. That's putting it ontologically. I think anybody who's not taken leave of their common sense says, there's feeling in the world. The problem isn't whether there is or isn't, and the problem isn't even whether there's two kinds of stuff, physical stuff and felt stuff. The problem is how and why do organisms feel. But so that translates the ontological problem into an epistemic problem. What can we know about feeling? There's another side of the mind-body problem, the other minds problem, which is traditionally thought of as being an epistemic problem, a problem about knowing. How can we know whether other organisms feel, and of course also what they feel, but the real problem is whether they feel at all. We see that they do, and probably we can be as sure about the fact that other people feel as we can about any other scientific regularity that we trust. Apples fall, people feel. They act like they feel. Apples look like they're always falling. I don't see any sign that tomorrow they're going to fall up instead of down. Maybe the other mind's problem is deeper than that. It's not just regularity, because not even in one instance, at least with the apples, you can say, I saw it fall. So far, I've seen them just falling down, or at least I think I've seen them falling just down. I've never seen them falling up. I've never felt what anyone else feels. And so therefore, even now, I don't know whether Marion feels. I have a suspicion that Marion feels. And the reason, what confirms that Marion feels, is that she not only acts like she feels. I've got 10 minutes left. Okay, I'll leave that for discussion. I want to suggest the following, and this is to put it into a little bit more controversial context. Another anecdote that I've told my students a lot is William James's anecdote about nitrous oxide. Raise your hands if you've heard that one, laughing gas. Okay, it's pertinent here, it's especially pertinent here. William James was probably either a cocaine user or something or other. He said that he had a friend who, whenever he smelled laughing gas, knew the secret of the universe. But the trouble was that after it wore off, he'd forget. So what he did was, one time he made up his mind that while he was under the influence, he would write down the secret of the universe, the meaning of life. And when it wore off, he rushed to see what he'd written, and what he'd written was, the smell of petroleum pervades throughout. Everything smells like oil. Now, I take it that we agree that that is not the meaning of life. What it is something that was going on in his mind at a time that he felt that he knew the meaning of life. But since, of course, even those who, I mean, in my particular sect, it was Advaita Samadhi, but or let's say it's Nirvana and Buddhism, even those who follow this path say that actually you can't explain it in words. You've got to experience the experience, you can't tell it in words. So it's not surprising that the smell of petroleum pervades throughout, doesn't convey what he felt. But of course, And now I'll use Russell again. Russell said that it doesn't just convey that, it conveys the fact that you can't always trust your feelings. Something might feel as if it's true, or if it is a certain way, and it may not be that way. Now, I do want to have a few questions over here from more than one person, so I'm going to cut it off in a second, leaving out lots of things that I meant to say. But I will say one thing, which is that meditation, about which I'm mildly ashamed at this age, but you can talk me out of it, is a kind of a spiritual orgasm, if you like. By the way, I was also going to show you the reference of a paper that Heath did called Pleasure and Brain Activity in Man Deep and Surface Electroencephalograms During Orgasm. That's one paper. And the other one is, of course, the famous Beauregard and Paquette paper, Neural Correlates of Mystical Experience in Carmelite Nuns. In any case, there's no question that subjective experiences of any kind, feelings of any kind, are personal, private things. What I want to suggest is that there are other minds out there. There are organisms, feeling, suffering organisms. My background slide went off, but it's the Occupy for Animals slide, which shows how they're being killed needlessly as we speak. I leave you with the message that it's not necessary for you, for your survival or your reproduction or your health, to hurt any sentient creatures the way that we're doing it now in the industrial scale. It's unnecessary, it causes enormous suffering, and it's infinitely more important than your spirituality. The only value, what matters is what's felt. And the only value of spirituality is if it makes you into the kind of entity that helps other living, feeling creatures to suffer less. Thank you.
Yeah, you were interrupted right when you were talking about you don't know what Marion might be feeling, but you know that she is feeling. Could you just finish that?
Well, I have two reasons. Number one is the usual one. It's called the Turing test. It's the way that we know anybody feels. If it behaves and talks and acts indistinguishably from the way that I do or anyone else that feels, I have no basis for saying that, it's just a zombie. That's the usual answer. The second answer that I give, and it's even more telling to me, is that Marion cares about the feelings of other sentient creatures. That doubles my confidence in the fact that she really does feel. I'm not so sure about psychopaths, the ones that don't care, that seem to behave as if it doesn't matter whether they're taking a leg off a chair or off of a dog. So with those, I kind of wonder. I'm pretty sure they feel, and I figure that if I pinch them, it's going to hurt them too, but there's something anomalous about their feelings. Marion's feelings, I understand. And it's the Turing test. It's always the projection of your own mental states onto others that behave the same way that you do. Other questions? Have I cut myself short for no reason? You want to hear about quantum mechanics? Yes?
How did you like Blackfish?
Pardon me?
How do you like selling Blackfish?
It's very hard. These Facebook likes are really a problem for me because I can't put a like down for something that displays horrors. But of course, I think it's wonderful that they did that film, and I hope that it sinks SeaWorld as soon as possible. Yes?
So given these criterion that you just discussed in terms of trying to decide whether something feels or not, does that apply across categories? Like, how do we know that animals feel? You
Yes,
can
of
infer
course.
that humans feel, but how do you know? That
Yes, of course, it applies to all living creatures. I hope, we're here at McGill where everything has happened. Bernie Grad did his screaming plant experiments here at the Allen Memorial. I hope that plants don't feel. But if they do feel, I'm in the same situation that I'm in when I'm being pushed under the water and my brainstem is forcing me to gasp for breath. I have to eat something. I believe, and on the basis of all scientific evidence to date, they have no nervous systems, they don't feel anything. On the other hand, mammals, vertebrates, invertebrates, and even very simple invertebrates have the machinery that's correlated with feeling that we trust in the case of ourselves. It's completely self-interested. I was going to talk about things like denial. is self-interested in denial to say, I'm sure I feel, I'm pretty sure that humans feel, but I'm not so sure that dogs feel. Of course dogs feel. Anybody that isn't psychopaths don't care whether dogs feel. Sadists know they feel because they get a pleasure out of making them suffer. Other questions?
I'm wondering about the point about sadism, for instance. If one can have an emotional reaction to feeling, one can feel guilty about feeling good about something or enjoy feeling good about something, then doesn't that introduce a sort of relativism into the motivation for caring about other feeling entities? Wherein it seems that to some extent you still need perhaps some sort of training or some sort of education, moral or otherwise, to actually sort of condition your feelings, don't you? Because otherwise it's not necessary that someone's going to feel badly for the fact that someone else isn't enjoying themselves, you know.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what your question is. You said lots of things. Let me try to answer some of them, okay? Oxytocin, which is a naturally secreted substance, without training, makes mothers care about what their babies feel, okay? They don't have to be trained. They immediately nurture them, etc. Maybe a couple of exposures. So, but I have no problem with training. If spiritual training, for example, made you more inclined to help others and prevent them from suffering, I'd be all for spiritual training. The trouble is that I find that spiritual training is headed mostly towards my own orgasms, my own spiritual orgasms. Whereas what we need is the kind of training that makes us help others. And I think that the internet is going to help us in that, because we have a lot of natural reactions to innocent creatures suffering, and when we see these images and we hear the testimony, it awakens something in us that's natural in us all. Ishan, and then, yeah.
So I'm really surprised that the meditation that you were doing didn't encourage you to be more compassionate or more engaged. And to me, it seems like maybe you weren't doing it right, because the Mario Beauregard research is pretty old. The Carmelite nun stuff is pretty old now. The more recent research, they're actually really interested in compassion and altruism and the ways in which meditation encourages that in people. And there's some very profound findings now showing that just short meditation practices do make you more likely to get up and give your seat to somebody who seems to need the seat more. So this this encouragement of compassion through spiritual practices like meditation. There's large replicated peer-reviewed papers.
You wouldn't win me back with something that made you give up your seat to other passengers, but you would win me back with something that demonstrated that it actually made people activists for animal suffering.
Yeah, so we should do that study. We apply for a grant.
Yeah, so we were talking about consciousness and feeling. Now, many organisms would react to a stimuli, and that we know, and amoeba would actually run away from a stimuli. Now, when our nervous system itself is actually geared, evolved such that when there's a certain painful stimuli and gets jerked out. Now, is it true to say that the kind of feeling that we are talking about, and you're using the word orgasm in a very interesting way, and I saw our venerable monk here kind of wincing at that. Is that feeling always associated with some kind of an emotional reaction as opposed to just a reaction to a stimuli? How do we differentiate the two?
Look, there's some very deep distinctions in what you're saying, and I want to bring them out. I did not talk about feeling and consciousness, because feeling is consciousness. And I didn't talk about different kinds of feelings. I did say orgasm, and I said it slightly ironically. But whether it's an orgasm, or it's an itch, or it's a pain, or it's seeing the color blue, all of these things are felt states. And conscious states are felt states. What people usually mean in the spiritual domain by consciousness is so-called higher levels of consciousness. But I wasn't talking about blue versus red versus green, or Advaita Samadhi versus Advaita Samadhi, or the sixth chakra or the fourth chakra. I was simply talking about feelings, itches. And itches don't matter so much. And in fact, the pleasurable side of the feeling spectrum doesn't matter so much. I was speaking mostly about the negative side, pain, suffering. That's what matters. That's what matters. And not my spiritual development. My spiritual, I can tell you the meaning of life. The meaning of life is the following. If you and yours are fed and sheltered and healthy and safe, the meaning of life is to help those that aren't. That's all. It's not a spiritual path towards a subjective realization. That's what I meant by orgasm.
That comes automatically when you do meditation. There's a thing called loving kindness meditation. I don't know whether you're aware of that. But when you practice loving kindness meditation, those things come naturally. Not only for your kind, you want to be a human being, be an animal, whatever. That comes naturally.
Actually, I'm not just talking about feelings for other animals, I'm talking about actions for other animals.
Actions too.
In the path that I followed, which happened to be yoga, there was karma yoga, which was selfless action. And it was encouraged, but I noticed among the practitioners, because I also looked at the statistics, among the practitioners of all of this, it was mostly people sitting down with crossed legs going into states. It wasn't people going out to shelters to help animals.
I've seen a lot of people, like I'm practicing meditation, a lot of people that I practice with, they do go to shelters, because you develop in a way kindness, compassion, it comes naturally, so.
I accept that, and I take Ishan's request. If we have objective evidence that meditators are helping animals, then I'll become a promoter of meditation.
Animals and humans, both.
And humans, of course. Listen, humans are animals. I've got that covered.
But it showed that a lot of studies showing that compassion can be trained. Like people can be learn. It's a learned technique.
I agree.
Yeah.
Once the technique is applied, and I see that it's actually producing practitioners, I'm converted.
Thank you.
That's good.
So, it's kind of a follow-up to the last question. Do you think the quality, let's say, of suffering is a function of intelligence? So, for example, is the suffering of an orca trapped in its tiny little cage
No.
the same as...
The answer is no. And in fact, Bentham had the right thing on that. Bentham's, I can't quote him exactly, he said, what matters is that animals can suffer, not whether they're intelligent or they can reason.
Maybe we'll take one final question and then go for coffee.
Okay. You mentioned the Turing test many times during your presentation. Now you must be aware that very recently artificial intelligence passed the Turing test. And so the artificial intelligence, according to your criteria, is conscious and can feel.
No,
Does that mean turning off the computer would be an act of immorality?
No, actually, not. The Turing test wasn't passed. And actually,
It was in all
you
the
can-
journals, it was passed.
well, if we're going to refer to journals, I suggest you actually look up the journal articles in which I discussed this alleged passing of the Turing test, or you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Turing in 1950 proposed the Turing test, which was to create a robot, if you like, a system that could do everything we can do indistinguishably from the way we do it. And he said, once you've done that, you will have explained intelligence or cognition and he said, and besides that, I predict that within 50 years, you'll be able to fool 70% of the judges for 5 minutes. And he was right. In 50 years, 70% of the judges were fooled for 5 minutes. But the Turing test is not fooling the judges, 70% of the judges for 5 minutes. That was a complete misunderstanding.
But
It is creating a system that is indistinct. Okay.
It's indistinguishable, I mean it's judged by objective reality as you
It's
described.
not judged by objective reality. It can go through a lifetime. One of the people in this audience should be able to open his head and say, look, I was built in MIT 3 years ago, but I've been going, so kick me now.
But then it can be. That is not the Turing test.
That is the
test,
Turing test.
The Turing test is, as I understand it, a great mathematician from Cambridge. He was he Oxford?
He was actually neither. It was Bristol,
This
or
one,
one of the northern universities.
Okay. But anyway, the Turing
Manchester.
test was,
Sorry, Manchester.
was to be able to fool people that artificial intelligence acts exactly the same way as consciousness as we understand it.
Nothing of the sort. The exact opposite. He gave a scientific program for actually producing a system that was actually conscious. And he didn't want to fool anybody. This is a complete misinterpretation of the Turing test that is about tricking or fooling. It's not. And this business with the judges has nothing to do with the Turing test.
But what is objective reality as you define it? Objective reality is where we judge experience, we judge phenomena, and when we judge it, we assume that it is what we experience or what we know as consciousness or feeling. That is why you're judging the psychopath to not have any feeling. You're judging sort of Marianne here, to have feeling. So
I don't know.
maybe she's feeling 5 minutes or a lifetime. What's the difference in
I don't know about objective reality. That's too ontological for me. But I know that there's a planet called Earth which has things in it called organisms, and those organisms feel. It hurts them if you kick them. That's what matters.
So you've just done the Turing test on them.
No, what I've said is that if you created an artificial robot that passed the Turing test, in other words, somebody in this room was indistinguishable from us in everything, in every way, for a lifetime, then I wouldn't kick that robot because it would have passed the Turing test.
And how far are we away from that?
Light years.
Really?
Yeah. All we can do is create some dumb devices that can barely get across the room without bashing their brains out on the
Dumb
wall.
devices that can be the best chess masters.
Yes, but with trickery. With trickery.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, because with a chess master you can say, why did you do that? And they'll give an account of their play, and they'll give an account of their lives, and you don't have to just talk about chess with them, you can talk about anything. You know that it's a person, but with this thing, all it does is you do a move, it doesn't move.
It's much more complex than that.
I agree, it's much more complex.
We will have another half hour to discuss this first theme after tea and coffee after Marianne's presentation, so I hate to cut things off, but some people might be a little bit thirsty.